I've lived on my family's ranch my whole life, and life and death are just part of it. Animals come into this world, and sometimes they leave it sooner than you expect. Most animals here have a purpose. They're raised for food or work. Sometimes they get sick, and other times they wander too close to a fence or something dangerous happens by accident. But every once in a while, something truly strange occurs, something you can't easily explain. This story is one of those strange events. My husband and I live in a quiet area of Colorado where we raise a small flock of sheep. We moved here a few years back, hoping for a slower life and a place to grow a family business. We bought some land with a cozy farmhouse and a barn, added a few fences to keep the local predators out, and started collecting animals from nearby farm sales. We started with a couple of sheep, and before we knew it, we'd added chickens and even a couple of goats. Each time we brought home new animals, we'd add a bit more fencing, and soon the place looked like a proper ranch. My favorite addition was the chickens. They'd wander around the property all day, picking at bugs, and then, like clockwork, they'd return to their coop at night. All we had to do was close their door. Every Saturday morning, we'd go to farm swaps in town, where we met a lot of local folks who shared stories, good and bad. Some would tell about animals they'd lost to heat or coyotes, and others would share funny stories or helpful tips. Eventually, we decided to get a dog to help protect our animals. We picked a Great Pyrenees, a big fluffy breed known to guard livestock well. We named him Tuck, and soon he was part of our family. He went everywhere with us, even jumping into the back of our truck as soon as he was big enough to make the leap. One summer, the weather turned unusually hot. The heat was so intense that some of our chickens started to struggle. One of them even passed away from the heat. We tried everything to keep them cool, adding fans and misters, but we couldn't be everywhere at once. By the end of the week, we'd lost a few chickens that hadn't come back at night, and we thought maybe they'd hidden somewhere in the shade and not made it. One Friday morning, we realized we'd forgotten to close the chicken coop the night before. As we walked toward the barn to check, Tuck ran ahead, barking loudly. He darted to the coop, sniffing around like something was wrong. As we got closer, I noticed a mess of feathers scattered around the area. There, right beside the coop, was one of our chickens, but it had been torn apart. It was a terrible sight. My husband looked at me in shock, but I had seen things like this before. I guessed it was a coyote or some other predator that had managed to squeeze its head through the coop door and grab one of our birds. But the real surprise came the next night. Around 10 p.m., we were just about to go to bed when Tuck started pacing and whining by the door. Then he let out a loud howl. I grabbed my flashlight, my husband grabbed his rifle, and we followed Tuck outside. He bolted toward the barn, growling and barking as he went. By the time we caught up, Tuck was facing off with something I'd never seen before. Standing just outside the barn was a creature that looked like something out of a nightmare. It was tall, much taller than any person, with thick gray fur that stood up like a mane on its back. Its face looked like a wolf's, but with fierce, sharp eyes and a broad, muscled chest. And the strangest thing, it was standing on two legs. The smell was terrible, like a mix of wet fur and something rotten. I aimed the flashlight toward it, and for a second, it snarled back at us. I raised the rifle, but before I could get a shot off, Tuck lunged at the creature. It grabbed him with ease, throwing him aside like he weighed nothing. My husband took a shot, but the thing was already moving, darting through the barn and out the back door. Tuck chased after it, and we followed, though we were both terrified. I made it outside in time to see Tuck hiding in the back of our truck. He was shaking, a look of fear in his eyes that I'd never seen before. I glanced around, heart pounding, trying to catch a glimpse of the creature, but it was gone. Then I saw it, just briefly. A shadowy figure, sprinting across the far end of the field, faster than anything I'd ever seen. It moved on two legs, then dropped to all fours and bolted into the woods, vanishing into the dark. I took a shot in its direction, but I knew I'd missed. Whatever it was too fast and too strange for me to wrap my mind around. I work with animals, the kinds that don't really belong where they are. Officially, my title is Exotic Animal Control Specialist. My job is to catch and relocate animals that are disturbing local ecosystems. For example, I trap iguanas from golf courses around Miami and remove large pythons from the Everglades. It's a unique line of work, but I make a decent living here in Florida. One day, I got a call to check out a strange situation in the Florida swamps near Everglades National Park. This area is wild, thick with cypress trees, water vines, and gnarled roots sticking up from the swampy ground. There's a constant buzz of insects, and the air has this heavy, earthy smell. People said something had been picking off raccoons and even alligators, but no tracks or typical signs were left behind. Only scattered pieces of the animals. The locals were spooked and kept whispering about an unknown creature roaming the swamps. I don't believe in monsters or supernatural creatures. I stick to what's real, what I can see and trap. But the folks who called me seemed desperate, so I agreed to go out and investigate. I headed down to the swamp in my truck, bringing my usual equipment. I had nets, traps, and cameras, expecting I might be dealing with a sick or aggressive animal. The sun was already setting as I pulled up to the edge of the swamp, and mosquitoes swarmed as soon as I stepped out. I met Joe, the man who'd called. He was an old-timer, a local with a quiet, serious look about him. Joe didn't use words like monster or cryptid, but his face showed worry. He told me about how this creature, whatever it was, had been disturbing the natural balance in the swamp. Joe didn't try to scare me, but there was something in his tone that felt like a warning. He told me he'd been out in the swamps his whole life and had never seen anything like it. When he finished, I promised him I'd do my best to figure out what was going on. He just nodded, looking at me with this somber understanding, like he wasn't sure I'd be able to handle what I was about to see. As the sun dipped lower, the swamp became an eerie, shadowy world, and everything was bathed in a fading light that seemed to come from nowhere. I set up cameras around the area, trying to capture any movement in case the creature showed up. I moved slowly, checking the ground for any tracks or signs of an animal. After setting up, I continued scanning the area. The swamp at dusk can be peaceful, but this peace felt strange. I could feel it in the stillness, a heavy sensation, almost like being underwater. My instincts told me to stay alert. I searched around trees, bushes, and dense patches of swamp grass. Just as I was turning around a mangrove tree, I saw it. Between the twisted roots and shadows, there was a shape, human-like but very wrong. It was no person, but it had the form of one. Its limbs were too long, its stance awkward and unnatural, as if it didn't know how to stand upright. And then there were its eyes. Bright, shining eyes that cut through the darkness, too intense, too sharp, like headlights. I squinted, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. The creature's outline seemed to blur and flicker as if it couldn't quite hold itself together. Its skin, or whatever it was, moved strangely, like it was alive, shifting over its frame like something inside was trying to get out. The limbs stretched and twisted unnaturally, like warped branches bending in the wind, and its eyes glared at me, steady and unblinking, like they could see right into me. I've seen a lot of wild things in my line of work, but this was different. In that moment, my job of catching invasive animals felt absurd. This wasn't an animal that could be tagged or recorded. It was something beyond my understanding. I wanted to call out, to say something, anything, but my throat felt dry. I was frozen, staring. And then, as if sensing my thoughts, the creature tilted its head. The movement was quick and jerky, almost like an insect. I saw its skin moving, almost writhing, like snakes under a thin layer of fabric. It was terrifying and fascinating at the same time. I don't know how long I stood there, but suddenly a distant splash snapped me back. I took a step back, and the creature did the same, retreating into the darkness. I didn't wait to see what would happen next. I backed away slowly, keeping my eyes on the spot where it had been until I couldn't see it anymore. My heart raced as I turned and made my way back to my truck. The next morning, I met Joe at a local diner. He knew just by looking at me that I'd seen it. I told him everything, and he listened without interrupting, a knowing look on his face. When I finished, he nodded and said, "You met the spirit of the swamp. It's no animal we can explain. It's ancient, a guardian of sorts, here long before us." I live in a small town in Texas, not too far from San Antonio. Right outside the town, there's an old abandoned warehouse. Everyone around here knows about it, and most people stay away because they say it's haunted or just plain creepy. But I'd always been a little curious. Rumors swirled around town about strange sights and sounds there, and I couldn't resist finding out for myself. One Thursday evening, I decided it was time to check it out. The whole scene felt like something from a movie, and it was almost dark enough to need my flashlight. I'd been planning to do this for a while, and my curiosity got the best of me. When I finally reached the warehouse, it looked even scarier than I'd imagined. The building was huge and quiet, standing against the darkening sky. Most of the windows were shattered, and the outside walls were covered with faded, peeling paint and graffiti. It felt like it was calling me to come inside, like it had secrets to share, and I was ready to listen. Taking a deep breath, I gripped my flashlight tightly and walked in. Inside, the place was just as spooky as I'd expected, if not more. The floor was covered with trash and broken pieces of old furniture. The walls had graffiti and strange drawings in all colors, some of which I couldn't quite make out. My flashlight's beam was small, but it helped me see just enough to keep walking forward. Every small noise felt louder than it should have, and the silence was heavy, pressing in from all sides. I wandered around the main area, taking in the shadows and the musty smell of old, forgotten things. Then, suddenly, I heard it. A soft scratching sound. At first, I thought it was probably a rat, or maybe just the building creaking. But the sound continued, steady and rhythmic, and it didn't feel right. It was coming from somewhere deeper in the warehouse. My heart started to beat faster. I tried to tell myself it was nothing to be afraid of, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Shining my flashlight in the direction of the sound, I squinted into the shadows, and then I saw it. In the beam of my flashlight, crouched low to the ground, was a creature. It didn't look like anything I'd ever seen before. It was long and thin, covered in what looked like wet, shiny skin, almost slimy. It was pale, almost sickly, with a ghostly white color. But the scariest part was its face, or rather, its lack of one. Where its eyes, nose, and mouth should have been, there was nothing. Just a smooth, blank surface. I felt frozen in place. This wasn't a person, and it didn't look like any animal I'd ever heard of. It was like staring into a nightmare. The creature was crouched in a strange way, its limbs bent at odd angles, and it moved in a jerky, unnatural way. It was like it didn't know how to control its own body properly. For a few seconds, neither of us moved. I felt like I was in a staring contest with this strange thing, though it didn't have any eyes. I was scared, but at the same time, I was strangely fascinated. I wanted to understand what it was, even though I knew it wasn't safe to stay. Then, the creature shifted. It moved quickly, almost like a blur, from one shadow to another. My heart was beating so hard I thought it might burst. I wanted to run, but my legs felt like they were glued to the floor. In that moment, every part of me was screaming to get out. The creature paused again, and I could feel it watching me, even though it had no eyes. The silence was so intense that I could hear my own breathing, fast and shallow. Finally, something in me snapped, and I forced myself to take a step back. Taking a shaky breath, I knew it was time to leave. My legs were weak, and my hands were shaking as I made my way back to the entrance. Each step felt heavy, and I kept looking over my shoulder, afraid the creature would come back. But everything was quiet, and all I could hear was the faint sound of the night outside. Hi everyone, my name's Rich, and I've been working as a park ranger at the Grand Canyon for a little over a year. I've always loved being out in nature, so this job is a dream come true. Before I started, I thought I'd just be helping people on trails and giving talks about the plants and animals around here. But since starting, I've heard some strange stories from other rangers, stories I thought were just to mess with the new guy. Now, I'm not so sure. When I first joined, my coworkers would talk about odd things they'd seen out here in the wild. Everything from strange lights in the sky to animals they couldn't quite explain, and even odd sounds echoing through the canyons. They'd tell these stories as if they were normal, but I thought they were just teasing me. I'm not one to believe in supernatural stuff, so I always laughed it off. They just shrugged and said, "Give it time, Rich. You'll see." Well, it turns out they were right. About a month after starting, I got called out to help a group of hikers near a place called Horseshoe Mesa. One of the hikers had hurt her ankle pretty badly, so a helicopter came to lift her out. When we reached them, the hikers looked spooked. They explained that, as they were hiking, they had seen something strange on a ridge above them. They described what they saw as some kind of animal that they initially thought was a mountain lion. But then the creature stood up on its hind legs, and they could see that it didn't have fur. Its skin was smooth and shiny, and when the sun hit it, they realized it didn't look like anything they'd seen before. One of the hikers took a few pictures and even tried recording a video. The images weren't clear, but when they showed them to me, I could make out two glowing yellow eyes in one of the photos. I tried not to laugh at their shaky, blurry shots, but those eyes definitely looked odd. They said the creature stared at them for a few moments before disappearing behind some rocks. But that wasn't all. After the creature vanished, they started hearing strange sounds around them, like a chittering or clicking noise. When they looked up, they saw not one, but 3 of those creatures on another ridge staring down at them. This time they were closer, and the hikers said the creatures looked like lizard people, almost human-like, but with heads like dinosaurs and those piercing yellow eyes. That's when they decided to leave. They picked up their pace, but the narrow trail made it hard to hurry. The whole time, the strange chittering continued, and they felt like the creatures were following them, even though they couldn't see them anymore. Suddenly, small rocks started falling around them. One of the girls slipped on a loose rock and twisted her ankle. Luckily, another hiker went ahead and managed to get a signal to call for help. By the time we reached them, the sounds had stopped and the creatures were gone. Back at the ranger station, the hikers had all kinds of wild guesses about what they'd seen. One thought the creatures were aliens, while another figured they might be some ancient species that had survived in the caves and mines around here. I wasn't sure what to believe, but I told myself it had to be a mountain lion, even if the blurry photos didn't really look like one. A week later, I was sent to patrol the Grandview Trail, which goes right past Horseshoe Mesa. I wasn't planning on seeing anything unusual, but I couldn't help thinking about those hikers and their story. I took my time as I walked, admiring the views. This is one of the most beautiful parts of the canyon, with layers of red and orange rock stretching out as far as you can see. I was alone on the trail, so I felt like I had the whole place to myself. As I got closer to Horseshoe Mesa, I suddenly heard a strange chittering sound. My heart raced as I looked around, remembering the hiker's story. Then, up on a ridge a little way off, I saw movement. I pulled out my binoculars and focused. My hands shook as I got a closer look. There, on the ridge, were two figures. They looked just like the creatures the hikers had described: smooth skin, lizard-like heads, and those unmistakable yellow eyes. When I got back to the ranger station, I told my coworkers what I'd seen. I must have sounded out of my mind because they just laughed and welcomed me to the club. They said that everyone who's worked here long enough has seen strange things and that I'd get used to it, but I'm not sure I ever will. John was 9 years old when he and his family moved into a new apartment. The building was old and quiet, standing at the edge of a small town with faded walls and cracked windows. His mom joked it had character, but John didn't like it. It felt cold, and there was a smell of dust that never went away. Sometimes he thought he heard whispers in the hall, but no one was ever there. The first few nights were lonely. His parents were busy unpacking, and John spent most of his time exploring his room, which had high ceilings and an old radiator that clanged at night. On the third night, as he lay half asleep, he heard a soft giggle. It was high-pitched, like a little girl's laugh. Startled, he sat up and looked around. Nothing. Just shadows in the corners of his room. The next morning, he found a dusty old doll sitting on the floor by his bed. It was strange because he was sure he hadn't seen it before. The doll's dress was faded pink with tiny lace details, and its painted eyes stared up at him with a blank expression. John felt a shiver and moved it to the corner, telling himself it was just a forgotten toy left behind by the last family. That night, the giggle came again. This time, it was closer. John pulled his blanket up, listening carefully. Then a voice whispered, "Do you want to play with me?" His heart raced. He looked around, his eyes wide, but the room was empty. "Who's there?" he whispered back, feeling foolish. There was silence, and then a soft whisper. "My name is Andrea." John swallowed, his throat dry. He wanted to get up and run to his parents' room, but his legs felt heavy. The next day, he tried to tell his mom, but she just laughed. "Old buildings make strange noises, sweetie," she said. "It's just your imagination." That night, as he lay in bed, he heard the voice again. "Don't leave me alone, please." Slowly, a soft glow appeared at the edge of his bed. It was the shape of a little girl, maybe his age, wearing a torn, old-fashioned dress that looked like it had been through too much. Her hair was messy, and her eyes were dark, wide, and filled with sadness. John's voice was barely a whisper. Who are you?" "I used to live here, a long time ago," she replied softly, tilting her head. "But I had no one to play with. Will you stay with me?" John didn't know what to say. Part of him wanted to scream, but another part felt sad for her. He nodded, not sure if he was dreaming. Her face lit up for just a moment, her sad eyes shining with a faint happiness. She sat at the end of his bed, and for hours they talked. She told him stories about the apartment, about rooms he'd never seen, people with old-fashioned names who seemed to have vanished. "Where did they go?" John asked one night, curious. "They left, just like everyone does," she said, her voice softer than before. "But I stayed. I was alone. I was playing by the stairs one day, and I fell. No one caught me." She looked down, her glow dimming as her fingers twisted the fabric of her dress. John felt a chill as her words settled in. That night, she left him alone, and he didn't hear her voice again for days. He started to miss her, even though he was scared. The apartment felt emptier without her soft whispers. One evening, as he walked by the stairs, He spotted her doll lying on the floor. He picked it up and held it tightly. "Andrea," he whispered, his voice trembling, "I won't leave you. You don't have to be alone."